Welcome to the Experts in Sport podcast, brought to you by the School of Sport, Exercise and Health Sciences at Loughborough University.
So today I'm with Professor Paul Downwood, and we're going to discuss the consistently low levels of sports participation and how we can start to improve them. We discuss government policy and its impact on participation rates. We look at the disparities that exist between different groups with some specific examples before asking what needs to change in government policy and implementation to have the biggest impact. Hi Paul, thanks for coming on the podcast.
It's my great pleasure to be here, Martin. It's a delight to talk to you and to our listeners about this important issue that has been central to government policy for a long period of time, that is weighted very highly, I think, in people's minds, sport, and that has challenges, long-term kind of persistent challenges with it. So trying to unpick some of these issues, I think, is really quite important.
Definitely, and obviously you've been working in this space for a long time, so I think we'll touch upon lots of things that may have happened over the years, and then we'll get to kind of the modern day and where we're at as well. But just to kind of set the scene, why is sport so important? Why is sport participation so important?
Well, of course, we need to make a distinction between individuals engaging in sport for their own personal reasons, right? So that's been the case since the origins of sport as we understand it today, coming through the public school system and so on, and the development of what we now understand to be the sports system in the UK. But I think where my focus is very much around the policy relevance of this and the implications of this and the funding for this. So really, if we think about the longer term development of sport policy, historically, government's interest in sport was really about physical fitness and developing the needs of the military, and some of this was connected with we've just been through Remembrance Sunday, but the sort of follow-up of the First World War and the need to have a more prepared sort of population that was physically fit and so on. But I think in the period after the Second World War, you have a progressive recognition that sport is part of wider social change and wider social enlightenment and benefits. So by the time you get to the late 1960s, certainly within what we now understand to be the European Union, there was the development of what was referred to as the Sport for All Charter, which is subsequently being developed into the European Sports Charter. But the key recognition of this was that sport enshrined in a sort of policy document or a recommendation or an ideal, is that individuals have the right of access to sport because of social cultural development, because of their educational impacts, their health, and so on and so forth. Now, that kind of broader movement is then picked up in the UK. So we have the Great British Sports Council, developed in 1972, which looked at sport in the round and very much championed what was known as Sport for All, which was picking up on the European theme. And actually, I'm old enough to remember playing my sport in the local authority leisure centre, playing football and athletics and so on, and I remember seeing these banners that said Sport for All. I had no idea what they meant at the time. I was only in my early teens, but this was a recognition or following large-scale investment in facilities, so a big expansion of swimming pools in local authority leisure centres and so on and so forth. So this Sport for All campaign effectively kind of dominated the European scene, and effectively, as I say, it set the sort of foundational background tone for a lot of policy since then. So I am glossing over a lot of the nuance and detail here, but I would say that's one of the key things. Now, it's important to recognise that policy has impacted on participation in a number of ways. One, as I've just indicated, by the direct provisioning of facilities. So people of my age will remember you went to your local authority sports centre. Very often now these centres may be owned by the local authority, but they're run by private sector contractors. They'll also be aware that there's a huge private sector fitness industry now. And so policy has not only shaped the direct provisioning, but it's also shaped the opportunities that are available. So providers have come along to fill gaps in order to provide specific sport offers, if you like, to the wider population. So we can link the growth of the private fitness centre to be, I guess, the availing themselves of opportunities created by policy. So I don't want to get too tied into the policy discussions, but in the early 1990s, particularly through the Local Government Act of 1999, local authority provision of services had to be outsourced and had to provide best value for the population. So part of this is just a kind of a change on the compulsory competitive tendering of public service that had happened in the previous years under the Margaret Thatcher government. So the Best Value Act was about trying to deliver access to services that provided the best value, as it were, stated in the Act, to the local population. Best value in the time was referred to in terms of economy, efficiency and effectiveness. So it was about cost, but it was also about delivering more output for the investment. So that's efficiency, but it was also effective, so you had to do it correctly and in the best way possible. So it wasn't just about cost. So I think those kinds of initiatives show how policy has helped to frame, or if you like, or to influence sports participation in the UK. And it's probably worth saying that the background to this is those activities weren't happening in a vacuum. There was recognition that participation rates were low and that was imposing kind of cost on society, particularly around health and so on.
If I just try and summarise some of that we've spoken about there, there's politics involved within this, but it does seem that this is something that is on the policy agenda no matter which government's in charge. It's just they're choosing to do things differently. And when you go back to a Conservative government potentially bringing more prioritisation potentially into the scenario, the Labour government came back in and maybe went slight swing maybe back to more the public side of things. We've then had a Conservative government that have, again, gone to all that private side. And this is obviously traditional, simple politics we're talking about now. And now we have a Labour government that have just come in. So I think, we'll go through some of the story. You mentioned lots of this due to participation, and I think we'll touch upon that in a moment, of what has happened over the last 20 years regarding participation. And then later on, I think we can then look at, well, what should this new government be trying to do to increase participation moving forward. So if it's all right with you, do you think now's a good time to touch upon like participation rates and where that's been over the past 10 or 20 years? Where are we now? What changes have we seen at all?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. It's probably worth just taking a slight step back just to say something a bit more about that policy change. And we can probably reflect on some of the strategic developments that have happened in terms of sports policy. But you're absolutely right. In a sense, the broad thrust of those policies has not changed so much in those strategies. And you can see that by examining some of the kind of broad strands and the ways in which participation has been measured by successive sports agencies. So I mentioned earlier about the Great British Sports Council in 1972, and that was responsible for looking at all sport, whether that be elite, the English football team or whatever it might be, and also participation. That's actually split in 1997, and it's split with a recognition that you needed to have a much more focused agenda around delivering elite sport. So UK Sport was formed, and one around mass participation, which is where what were known as the Home Nation Sports Council developed Sport England, Sport Scotland, the Sports Councils for Northern Ireland, and the Sport Council for Wales. So those agencies were set up as arm's length organisations to deliver the policy change. And so key to that was various strategic initiatives that were put in place to try to promote participation and hence to sort of try and measure it and understand what's actually happening. So just to give you a sort of a quick overview of the policy changes, I guess when the Tony Blair government came in, there was a strategy called Game Plan that was put in place. And Game Plan made it very, very clear, reflecting on those changes that had happened in the sport policy delivery environment. So you have the separation of UK sport and the sports councils. And Game Plan really much talked about we need to be good at both of these things. There was a strong emphasis on elite success, hosting events. Of course, that led to the successful bidding for 2012 and so on, but also about increasing mass participation. Interestingly, within that Game Plan document, it's quite clear that government wasn't to provide sport. Government's role was to step in where there was what was referred to in economic language as market failures. In other words, there was the kind of private sector or individual actors working in their own interests didn't deliver enough sport, or there was some kind of inequity. So there were areas of kind of deprivation that needed addressing. Now, it's also worth recognising that policy split was also matched by a huge increase in funding to those agencies because of the development of the national lottery. So there's a kind of a sea change of sports policy happening around the end of the 1990s, early 2000s. But interestingly, if you look at the subsequent strategy, so for the one, it's called the Sporting Future by the Cameron government in 2015, because there's a big gap between the two documents. That really pretty much emphasised the same thing, but just made it really clear that funding would only go to sport if it delivered these key outcomes of physical well-being, mental well-being, individual development, social and community development, and economic development. And probably consistent with a move to the sort of conservative side of policy, there was less concern about who delivers these. So this is where you start to get recognition that charities in the private sector can equally play an important role in delivering policy outcomes. And actually, one of the more recent strategies, which was Get Active, that came out under the last few days of the Sunak government in 2023, that's reiterating a commitment to those objectives. But it also recognises that sport needs to be more inclusive, particularly targeting women, those who are sometimes in gerontological terms known as the old people over 75, those with disabilities and long-term health conditions, and for some ethnic groups. And I think it's worth emphasising that some, because when we look at some data, you can see that you can't just assume that different ethnic groups have collectively less participation than, say, the dominant white British population. There's a focus on participation, meeting World Health Organization levels of 150 minutes of moderate intensity. And there's a recognition also that is important, as we'll mention later, about a geographical emphasis that, place matters. And of course, perhaps people remember the levelling up agenda of what was then the Boris Johnson government, but it kind of carried through. That whole approach is to recognise that the inequalities that we see in society are spatially distributed. They're not a uniform thing, and so policy has to sort of reflect on that.
There's a couple of really interesting pieces I think that you brought up there. So you mentioned 2015 and 2020, 2022, all these strategies that came together, all pointing towards a number of similar elements, which in my head, it's interesting of like how can you monitor some of this in regards to, you're talking about economic or you're talking about mental health, and it appears that the Sport England strategy is broader in terms of, we've started this conversation, we're talking about participation in sport. That's a very simple thing, but now we're talking about actually sport is much more than just participation. So there's bigger reasons why we're doing it. And it started to step more towards potentially physical activity and health, not just sport. So I think there's potentially lots more to this. What is it that's being measured when we are trying to measure the outcomes of these strategies?
No, that's a very astute comment, Martin, because actually just to backpedal slightly, and again I'm going to talk here primarily about Sport England because it's the context in the home nations that I understand the best. But you're right, so one of the earlier strategies that was called Excel, Sustain and Grow, I think this was between 2008 and 11, the key there was to focus exclusively on sport. And there was a recognition that, for example, there might be health impacts, but sport was the key driver. Once you get to 2012-17, there was a strategy of sporting habit for life. And again, that was very much about focusing on participation for its own sake, really, but recognising that you need to work with wider stakeholders to deliver outcomes. Once you get into 16 and 21, we're towards an active nation, you then see that there's a focus very much on those outcomes that come from Sporting Future. And it's not really just about participation for its own sake. It's very much around health. So there's a kind of a sense there that if you're going to get public money, you've got to do something that's beyond just sport. So you see over this 15-year period a kind of movement towards seeing sport as a policy lever. And it's not just the traditional mechanisms of sport delivery, so our voluntary sports club system, that's going to do that. There's a wider set of stakeholders that are involved. And to talk about the sort of, to get onto the sort of data side of things, following game plan, we start to get very detailed monitoring of sports participation, particularly in England. So Sport England commissioned something called the Active People Survey that measured people's participation at a local authority level. So it's kind of representative of each local authority in England, huge range of activities. and across a lot of different dimensions to the behaviour. Do they participate or not? How frequently? How many minutes? What's the intensity? This changes also in 15-16 to become the Active Life Survey, and it starts to embrace a wider set of activities than just sports. So cycling and walking are included, not just from the point of view of recreation, but also in terms of what you might call active travel. And so there are activities like dance and so on that are recorded as well. So you can see this kind of movement away from a focus on traditional sports into, and including with the monitoring, onto these kind of wider activities, and perhaps non-traditional ways in which they're delivered.
Just for our wider audiences, just to know, Paul's background is in rugby, but he threw dance in there because he's quite the ballroom dancer. So just so you all know that.
Yes, and they're equally as difficult in their own ways. But shared, actually, funny enough, that motor control issue I hadn't thought about much, but I found it ironical that I have less interest than my wife in dancing. I'm saying this, of course, but I think I find I cope better, particularly when ballrooms are crowded, because I'm used to playing
in the pack,
basically. So yeah, and it does make me think, actually, and this is a serious issue actually about physical education for young children, that the squeeze in the curriculum of access to this kind of learning about your body and its physical capability and those motor control skills that I'm sure our very illustrious biomechanics that the faculty can elaborate far more than me, and also the pedagogy staff that we have here at Loughborough. But that idea of exposing children to the ability to be able to engage in sport right at a very early age is so important, but we've kind of neglected that.
Well, I mean, we could go off on a huge tangent, which I sometimes do on these podcasts around PE. So my background being a PE teacher, we could talk about that forever and a day. But I think there's loads of other interesting elements that we can get to. Another one that I think we may have to bring up later is around voluntary sports clubs, because again, now the agenda is set from Sports England and it's more focused on health and other sides of things, not just sport. I think there's an interesting piece there in relation to voluntary sports clubs who, aren't necessarily interested in that side. They're interested in, I'm running this because I love this sport. I love football. I'm doing football for football's sake, not necessarily for anything wider or deeper. And I just think it's probably another interesting question, which we may go down some rabbit holes later on. But let's just refocus, we're talking participation and participation rates. We've moved towards the Active Life Survey now. So how have things changed in the past 10 or 15 or in years? What's going on with sports participation?
Right, so I thought it might be instructive just to highlight a few details, and I'm going to draw here on data from the Active Life Survey, which just to remind our listeners, was a kind of a redevelopment of the Active People Survey in 2015. So I'm really just looking at data from then, really. And I guess one of the things that we should note right from the outset, because the current data that's available takes us from between roughly 2015-16 up to 2022-23. And one of the things that we can note, if you look at any of the sports that are recorded by the data, is that COVID's had an effect. So not only do you see a dip in the sort of 2019-20, 2020-21 period, but importantly, participation levels haven't recovered back to that level. Now, they vary across sports. So, for example, if one looked at fitness activities, participation rates in 15-16 were averaging around 14%. Post-COVID, during COVID, they dropped to about 12%, and they're now recovered to about 13%. If you look at swimming, 11% in 15-16, collapsing to 3.9 or 4% during COVID, and then recovered back to about 9%. If you look at football, a similar thing. So participation rates hover around about 5%, fell to below 4 in the COVID period, and then stayed fairly low. They've actually continued to fall to about 3.9. So clearly some of that was about what you were able to access during COVID. So we know that fitness centres opened in some ways. Pools didn't open immediately. Obviously, initially outdoor sports were completely shut down. So the football measure I'm referring to there probably encapsulates some informal activity. It won't be just the formal kind of club-based system. So those are the things that you sort of identify. And it's really important to recognise that Sport England's most recent strategy, which is United the Movement, really does talk about recovering and reinventing. sport, because undoubtedly COVID has had a big shock. And of course, there were shocks before that and concurrent with that. So we know that following the financial crash in the 2008-9 period, that local authority finances, like finances generally, were very strongly hit, and that had an impact. And of course, we can think about the cost of living crisis that was in part prompted by, for example, the Ukraine war and so on, and fuel cost increases. That's also caused tremendous difficulties, particularly for example, running swimming pools and so on. So thankfully, Sport England did put together an emergency relief package, particularly through COVID, to try to stave off some of the worst consequences of that, because at some point there were kind of forecasts that 400 and 500 something pools could close as a result of that. And when you think that when we talk about sport generally, what we often neglect to recognise is people who are sporty people often do multiple things. Mm-hmm. So if you take something like swimming away, it kind of has knock-on implications.
Well, the local centre where I am, the swimming pool's still closed now. Yeah. There's a load of politics around it of how much it's going to cost to either refurb it or rebuild it and what's going on, but it's closed. Yeah. And I know that's a story across the country with swimming pools in particular. What I might throw you under the bus here. I'm looking at. I was interested in that participation rate. So you're saying there that football declined and has stayed below where it was. Yeah. What happened with cycling? Because cycling, obviously, at the time, and this is me, anecdotally or whatever, is cycling. There seems to be everyone either buying a Peloton or getting on their bike and getting active outside. Do we know what's happened with cycling at all?
It would follow the same broad trajectory, which is slow decline, COVID hits, then it comes back. Now, the interesting thing, of course, with cycling is, are you measuring like with like? Because people could cycle more during COVID outside, but equally people took up kind of fitness cycling. So that might well be captured in the fitness stats, which show that they held up, you see. So when people ask questions, they're asked about the activity, and it might talk about an exercise bike. So it's not entirely clear how people would have responded to that question. So there's a little bit of noise in the system, but the broad trajectory is effectively the same. And I know there's been sort of anecdotal evidence of when, say, cycle routes were put in place during the COVID peak because of less traffic, people cycled a lot, and of course subsequently they've been rolled back, which has caused some sort of issues for cyclists. But of course motorists are also arguing that it's slowing them down. So this highlights the complexity of trying to manage people's participation when you link that to active travel and you link that to wider kind of economic and change that's happening, not in terms of policy, but in terms of, say, recovery from COVID and people needing to get back to work. There's encouragement to come back to the office. So people need to travel more. You can't always travel on public transport. It's not always possible to use your bicycle and so on. So these are very complex issues. Yeah.
And where are we with the general trend? So you gave us some numbers there, but generally in terms of sports participation and population taking part in sport, have we got a general figure for anything, or is it?
Yeah. I mean, probably what I should say, it depends on how you measure it. So people should always interpret these percentages. I was going to say with a pinch of salt, but I shouldn't really say that as a statistician. But it depends on the measure that you use. So, for example, what I was referring to here is, for example, participation rates of at least twice in the last 28 days, and that's one of the key performance indicators that's measured. If you're lucky enough like me to research and look at the raw data, you can actually investigate longer periods of time and the exact minutes that people do and so on. So these are broad trends. So if you ask people, have you undertaken this at least once in the last 12 months? And the numbers are going to be really high. Yeah. If you're asking people, have you done this at least twice in the last 4 weeks? They're going to be lower. Yeah. Because you're picking up somebody who's got more of a habit. So it kind of depends on what the question is you're asking.
If I ask another question around that, why would that be the measure that we're measuring? And this is just, again, in my head. If it has started to take a swing towards health, and you mentioned earlier the 150 minutes per week that is targeted, why is that not part of the question? Or is that part of the question anyway?
Yes, so it'll be moderate intensity of activity.
Okay.
So that's also in the data, so you can identify that as well. So you're absolutely right. So an interesting thing about active lives and active people, I'm bracketing together here, they were quite innovative, I think, in terms of the way in which they were developed, because when I'm old enough to remember researching these areas before they were developed, we used general social surveys. So one was called the General Household Survey. And they literally asked people across about 40 activities, have they done this in the last 12 months or not? And have they done it in the last 4 weeks? And the argument for having the difference in the two was, how good is your memory over 12 months? Yeah. And how good is your memory over the last 4 weeks? So clearly to ask for a shorter period of time makes more sense. You can always argue about recall, but that shorter period of time is quite important. And actually, when they're looking at the intensity of participation, they'll be asking about the last week.
So is that asked as well within
Yes,
that?
yes. So it's not reported on the kind of what's often publicly available through a kind of web-based interface you can look at, but it's there in the raw data. So they'll ask about the last week. So obviously your recall is much stronger. The other thing that's nice about the survey, it's based on what's called a rolling cross-section, because one of the problems before is if you ask people, have you participated in the last 4 weeks, and it was August, and you asked about football, then the chances are you won't have done because it's the end of the season. So by having a rolling survey that's collecting data throughout the year, the data is reported roughly from sort of November to October, you deal with that seasonality, and that's really good because it means you get a more genuine measure. And as I said to you before, it's representative at the level of local authorities, and it's representative across key socio-demographics, so that it's kind of representative of the national population. So it's a really great tool.
Well, we've spoken there generally about the participation, but is there more data more specifically? So, going out there, knowing what has been targeted more recently, so males and females and gender and disability, all these things were mentioned at the start. Is there some disparities between these groups?
Oh, for sure. But this is what I always feel a bit of sympathy for our sports policy agencies, is that the picture is quite complex. It's very easy to say there's disadvantaged groups, but actually kind of depends on where you look and what you're looking at. So, for example, if you look at gender, then it's quite clear in measures of football that the men participate more than women. And that's notwithstanding the recent successes in the development of the game. There's still quite a huge disparity, despite all the great work that's been done in developing women's football between men and women. The other thing we should note is that informal forms of participation are greater than the formal ones. If you turn that on the head and looked at something like fitness activities or swimming, then you'll tend to find that females participate more, right?
Yep.
If you go to something like ethnicity, and this is a very interesting one, and I'm just now referring to say, white British is the dominant sort of socioeconomic characteristic or ethnic characteristic, then they're not necessarily the top in terms of their own ethnic group. So, for example, they're not in terms of football, not in terms of fitness, and not in terms of swimming, although white British is higher in that measure. So there's quite a degree of distributional change. And if you looked at specific sports like, say, basketball, you'd find that black British participation would be higher than the majority populations. Clearly there are age trajectories, and partly these are driven by, I guess, physiological capability and the decline of he says, getting on with it. I had to stop playing rugby. But if you look at something like football, then there's a 16 to 34 is kind of a key age group, but certainly younger, and then it kind of tails away relatively quickly. If you look at something like fitness, then you're really looking at middle age and above as being quite stable and high, and likewise with swimming, middle age and above. So it sort of depends on what you look at. Now, socioeconomic status, and this is maybe something we can come back to again, is really quite an important one. And this is where football, I think, is a bit different from other sports, and people think of it as the national game, but quite clearly across socioeconomic characteristics, particularly people's socioeconomic status, which is kind of linked to their occupational and access to income kind of indicators, that with football it's relatively homogenous. The students are obviously the highest participants, but it remains relatively homogenous. Whereas if you look at something like swimming and fitness, then you tend to find that there's a gradient of participation that's connected to your socioeconomic advantage. So if you're more well off, you'll participate more than if you're lower. And that kind of holds up regardless of what cyclical change there is, even with COVID or whatever. So there is this kind of socioeconomic gradient with a lot of these activities.
Have you got any reasons that you suspect for some of that? Now, obviously, with a gym membership, for example, it seems fairly obvious that people might be priced out of the market. And is it then for saying that doesn't happen in football? Or what's the reasons behind some of that?
Well, this is a very interesting question, Martin. And most of the research that's taken place is looked at what we might refer to in economic language as the demand side from the participant and what factors influence them. We can perhaps refer to the sort of supply side and facilities later. if you look at the things that are connected to people's participation, then theoretically there's probably 2 or 3 major disciplinary areas that investigate this. One is kind of psychological, and it's about behavioural change. One is more kind of economic, which is to do with access to resource, and that includes time and so on, and access to money, of course. And then the third one is kind of more sociological, linked to cultural and identity stuff. So again, if you were to look at specific sports, you looked at, say, rugby union compared to, say, football, you would see that higher socioeconomic status is connected more with participation compared to, say, football. But this comes back to the point that you're making about fitness. One of the arguments that's put forward for the growth of the fitness industry is that it's resource efficient. So it's economical in time. And actually, it's economical in terms of paid resources. If you play a team sport, you may be at the competitive level, you may be training twice a week, you might need specialist kit, you might be travelling to play. We know that the advent of the 24-hour gym has been incredibly important in terms of holding up participation rates, particularly what we've talked about already, the fitness industry. So here you could pay what is a relatively low access to membership and attend classes or go to do the bits of fitness that you want to do. And it's significant that this seems to be where females participate more than males. Because actually, if you look at some of the reasons why, in the Active Life survey, that people are saying they're not participating as much, it's to do with things like having to have a second job, some voluntary thing, or caring responsibilities and so on. So there is still that extra burden that seems to be placed on women, and that will be connected potentially to their choice of the activities that they do. Now, of course, women's football is different, but you look at the vast majority of participants at the moment, they're still at that kind of younger age, and certainly it's very high amongst student populations. So it's yet to percolate through to the wider, to different age groups. It will come with time, of course, as that generation goes through, but at the moment, it's going to be tricky for people who say, 35-year-old mother of 2, to be able to suddenly find the time, even if they wanted to, given the circumstances that they might face themselves. And they're kind of challenges that are not easily solvable by sports agencies, because they're more about socio-economical kind of circumstance.
But whereas potentially with the fitness piece, if they were to try and find time, they could potentially find it because it's more flexible, especially the 24-hour side. Yes. Whereas if you're playing for a sports team and you've got to go and train at 6 or 7 o'clock or whatever, you've got children or you've got a job, it's not as flexible, therefore potentially you can't.
Yeah, and I mean, this is also connected to the nature of the fitness industry, which is churned phenomenally. So if you were to look at, say, 2005 and look at the key market providers, I would say there were those kind of big brands, your Total Fitnesses and stuff like that, David Lloyd Leisure, that were almost kind of like your white gown sort of fitness facility and so on. If you look at the market leader now, which might be Pure Gym, and you ask yourself, why is that? Well, memberships are relatively cheap.
Yeah.
I would say probably below £40 a month for unlimited use in most areas, and probably less.
I think you're still getting 25 in some.
Yes, very much so. Certainly in my hometown. If you look at the time, they're open 24/7. And if you look at the opportunities to do things, they've got high quality equipment. So people often unfairly call these budget gyms. They're not. They're just non-labour intensive.
They've stripped out the 2 major costs, which is staff and swimming pool type
That's
things.
right.
That's the big thing they've done.
Which comes back to the previous point, that if this growth of the fitness centre is not providing swimming pools, then who's going to do that? And that's the importance of swimming pools to community and for public policy, because you're right, these are things that cost money. They're not going to be something that's profit driven is going to necessarily provide. And in some respects, what's left of your old local authority system is caught between a rock and a hard place, because they want to and have to provide this access to these, but they're also having to compete for memberships with a provider that's very much focused on their needs. And that comes back to women again. If you wanted to swim on your own and do lengths, maybe in a local authority system, you would have to go to a specific period of time. If you want to exercise at a time that suits you, and it may or may not involve swimming, certainly work with Pure Gym, but some providers do, then you've got flexibility to do that. And so you could see why these are important in a modern time compressed world. And we should remember also that many people are doing multiple jobs, on top of everything else in order to make ends meet. So part of this COVID impact has also been about precarity of employment and opportunities and so on.
Interesting. We've probably not got time to go into it now, but that kind of public-private charity sector piece in and around a local authority owns the leisure centre and swimming pool, and then often they're being ran by either private or charity organisations. But if you've got a swimming pool, it's going to cost a lot of money. So interesting space to be in around, private organisations in particular wanting to take over ownership of them. First thing they're going to do is close the swimming pool because it's not profitable.
This is the big threat. And also for team sports too, what you don't want is empty space. So you've got outside courts, outside facilities, they're costly to run. But of course, and this is important to recognise, the private sector is also helping to sweep that up. So if you think about the development and origin of things like your power leagues and your short-sided footballs and so on, these are providing a lot of opportunity to people to play, particularly football. And as I said to you before, informal football is probably the largest. It's well over half of those who play football. Those that play informal football also probably play 11-a-side, but not necessarily the other way around. So that access to informal football and informal facilities provided by the private sector is really quite important. And as you mentioned before, particularly for very disadvantaged communities, we have some very strong charities, your greenhouse sports, your street games, all of these agencies that have come in to work with those communities to develop the right offer for those, considering they're very successful. So I guess what we're getting at there is it really is a complex picture, and one kind of policy intervention is not going to necessarily hit all of the segments of that community. And again, to come back to the issue about flexibility and female, so a lot of the research would say that why is it there's a gap between, say, men and women? And partly it's about the competitive nature of things, but partly it's about co-creating with friendships. We know that's the case in some volunteering stuff, particularly around major events. You could see that, for example, in the success of something like Parkrun, that takes the competitive element out of it. Very successful in recruiting women runners, family runners, and so on and so forth. So all of these things that's a kind of a modern version of a voluntary activity that traditionally underpinned the sports club, but it's far less structured. And so it kind of fits in with those pressures that people face and takes away perhaps some of the competitive element of things that those who play competitive sports like, but are often seen as an obstacle for people to get involved if they're not so sure about that.
A lot of your research, you've done a lot of research into participation, and we've touched upon some of those different areas and different targeted groups. What has the biggest impact upon participation? Is it simply being male or female? Is it different ethnic groups, or is it the socioeconomic kind of piece?
Yeah, I mean, this is a tricky one because, again, it comes back to measurement and the size of effects. But I think probably without question, gender's very big. Gender's very big. And I think that's widely recognised, and that's important. I would say that one of the things that really follows up after that is the socioeconomic stuff, as you mentioned before. And I think some of this has got a little bit lost in the general thrust of policy. So there's been a huge amount of effort focused on it, but not only in terms of policy, but in terms of measurement on what the outcomes of sport participation are. And one of those is social outcomes, right? Like social inclusion, so on, employability, as well as health and well-being. And in fact, people put measures on that. Sport England have recently announced that in excess of £100 billion worth of value is created by the economy through participation in terms of those outcomes. But actually, maybe we should kind of reverse our direction of thinking a little bit and say, but maybe those socioeconomic things are one of the key things that's actually driving behaviour. So if you get those right, you kind of get the outcomes simultaneously. So what's driving what? Right. So the current thinking is sport will deliver those things, but maybe those things are also important for delivering sport. And if you look at the raw stat, socioeconomic status and gender are two of the key and the main players. Now, it doesn't mean to say ethnicity doesn't matter, because they're clearly going to intersect. Minority groups and female minority groups are going to be doubly, triply disadvantaged. As a percentage of the population, they're small, but for them it's super important. And that again creates challenges for policy. And because you've got such a complexity of potential factors, and things that might deal with, in inverted commas, women in general may not suit particular minority ethnic women.
You brought us to that piece there really about the future of policy. And so, what does all this mean for the future of policy, and in which direction, would you think we need to start going in with a new government in place, the understanding of where things are at and the complications of everything? Which way should they be pushing to make some changes in this?
Well, actually, much as sometimes when you do sit and think politically, we tend to think very much in binary terms. But I do think that one of the important things that came out of the last Conservative government was this idea about levelling up and the need for spatial and local development. We do know that communities, because of historical reasons of industrial change, concentration of particular characteristics of populations, or areas where you've got this embedded inequality. So that idea of having a place-based approach that we see talked about a little bit now, it seems to be absolutely the right thing. And I think it's really encouraging that Sport England are currently expanding their place-based partnerships activity. I think they're going to, invested over, £250 million in this, because it strikes me this is the right way to go. Because taking a very helicopter view and saying this intervention might affect this individual characteristic is maybe then going to miss the complexity and the feedback, because it depends on the type of the sport and it depends on the characteristics of the community and the complex interrelationship of those characters. By focusing more in local areas, you would hopefully pick up on some of those factors. Now, that's where there's going to be a bit of an uneasy trade-off between public sector financing, what's clear as lines of communication, challenge and evaluation, and some of the complexity and difference that's required at the kind of very disaggregated level. And clearly also that speaks to having a multiplicity of agencies involved. So we've talked about the charities, we've talked about the fitness providers and so on. But I would imagine in the local areas, what policymakers need to know is what things are really working well. We don't need to touch what public resource we can get. We can target those at the very heart to reach kind of communities. But that's going to vary according to areas. So there won't be a ready-made mixture. So it's questionable about whether the current political apparatus is set up to be able to monitor that. As you're probably aware, Sport England and other agencies used to have regional offices. They still, to some extent, do, but it'd be interesting to see whether they have the personnel and the characteristics to deliver on those things, despite the efforts that they put in. So thinking about how you deliver that place-based stuff is the next piece in the jigsaw, really, because systems that were set up for one kind of policy regime may not be the appropriate ones for the future.
There's probably some key bits to think about in terms of, where we're at and taking stock a little bit as well in terms of gaining that understanding and gaining that information. And hopefully, I've seen jobs advertised around the place-based kind of things for Sport England, which will be interesting to pick up on. Some of it comes back to and reminds me of some of the things that Street Games do, because they have, and I'm going to get this, not fully on the head, but they have like a right people, right place. It may include right time, but I think that's certainly important, because some people in some areas might be ready for change. Others might be in a stage where actually we don't know what we need yet. So it's a different approach in different areas based upon them. You go wider into different things and you talk about, well, all these things, so gender, age, ethnicity, all key pieces, and loads of different regions have different makeups in their region. So we'll need different things. Yeah. But I don't think we're at a place where we understand that. Facilities been another one. What facilities are available and what money do we have for new facilities, or what facilities do we have that we can actually utilise?
And you're absolutely right on all of these levels, because clearly if you've got some crass policy that says I'm going to raise participation by this over the next kind of 12 months or something, then the rate of that increase is going to be very different across the area. So does that mean someone's failed, or they just face more challenges? They basically mean probably the same thing. You can't succeed when you face more challenges. So it's how do you then correctly evaluate the efforts and initiatives of those people? You're right about places. Most of us, I'm sure you do as well, Martin, we probably travel to the facility that we use. Now, it may be in a community then that people feel quite disenfranchised from, and all the people that are using it are travelling in. Does it meet the needs of its local community? It's very difficult to see how that might be the case in all circumstances.
It's a deeper question there around finances.
Yes.
And over the years, there's certainly been funding available to put some of these venues into more deprived areas. But if you're in a deprived area and you've got to pay X amount to use the facility, then it's a spanky nice new facility, but the locals can't use it because they can't afford to, and people are being shipped in from outside to use this new facility.
And of course, it isn't recognising the socio-economic composition of participation. So if we go back to some of those theoretical ideas about people's identity formation, the economic resource they have, the kind of sociological kind of identities they have, are those just providing those things, build it and they will come, going to be adequate? Or is it about behaviour change, which is about something that's tailored and co-created with them, which comes back to the significance of agencies like sort of street games. And even for the voluntary sports club system, the traditional sports club system, one of the things we don't well know is what is the relationship between informal activity and the formal activity. So we mentioned before about multi-sports people. I know you, keen football, and Martin, you probably swam, ran, go to the gym, but play football for, in a short-sided portion and a full-sided portion. Could those informal activities make sense and exist without the competitive thing that kind of provides a sense of what that activity is, even though you don't play it? Are they different? And I think this is a very important, for example, in terms of, say, women's football, because we know that a lot of the competitive 11-a-side football is played by younger girls and women, particularly in the club system. But what happens if you're in the wider community and you've never played before? How comfortable would you be to turn up to try to engage in that? Yeah. Now, there's been successes with netball, but probably most of those women would have experienced netball before when they were at school. If they've never experienced football, even though they like it, it's a big jump for them to try and get engaged. But if there was some informal opportunity for them to engage in, then maybe that could be the stepping stone. So like you could see with different sports, you would need different mechanisms to both attract people and to widen their sort of horizons, as it were, in terms of engaging in activities. So I think that reconciliation of the locality of where people live, the diversity of what they do, the different types of opportunities that are available to them, and their kind of previous experiences, for all of these things create really significant challenges for sport. But you could clearly see how more localized knowledge is going to be beneficial there, but you're not going to get synchronization, and in terms of outcomes, you just can't.
Yeah. No, it's really interesting that just making me reflect as you talked about it, because randomly you talked about me playing football when I was younger, maybe swimming, maybe fitness, maybe running. That's the journey I went on. I swam to be fit to play football. I loved football. I was competitive. I was reasonable, and I swam. Then at 14, I was probably fairly small, started going to the gym, knew that benefited me, and now own a gym and love the fitness side. I played vets football, but got injured and all the rest of it. But without the football, I probably wouldn't have got the other pieces. But because of the other pieces, I could potentially still play football. So the interconnection of all those sports, formal, informal, it really, really interesting to kind of help me reflect.
Yeah, and to close up on that, I did mention a bit tongue in cheek before, and you did as well. Thank you for mentioning it, my dancing thing. But actually, when I'm coached in my dancing, it's no different than sport. So it's, where does your body go? Where's the momentum? Is it a heel toe, a toe heel, a toe flat, right? It's all of that technical stuff that appeals to sport. So I would never have engaged, which I see is an important part of my physical activity now. I would never, I think, because I was able to grasp the thing easier, it allowed me to make the transition into doing something I didn't feel comfortable with in terms of my identity, right? Because bloke, playing rugby, blah, blah, blah. Now I hasten to say I don't wear sequins.
Just put it out there, he doesn't wear sequins. Okay.
But do you know what I mean? Because I got the process and what was involved, I really then started to enjoy the challenge. And so one of the things that I did mention from my earlier research, which I think is something that we've lost sight of a little bit, was this concept of sporty people, cultural people, and so on. So if you talk to musicians, they're multiple musicians, right? They pick up stuff and they play. Linguists tend to be multilingual. It comes back to sporty people who engage in things. They enjoy the physical activity culture. And that might mean, it's not about individual sport, and it's not about individual mechanisms of playing sport. It's more about trying to promote this portfolio of opportunity and engagement. Now, that's a bit tricky in the current system when you've got separate governing bodies looking at separate areas of sport. Funding is going down those vertical channels, but you've got the challenges about the wider population, and somehow some cross-cutting has got to develop. And I think the place-based stuff will very quickly recognise that. But it is a challenge in terms of, and this comes back to the point, if you're funding stuff, it's easy to pull money down a vertical channel because you can give people something to deliver this. Did it do it? Did it not? But if you deliver something to that person, but actually the outcome was over here for that person, that's your success as well.
Yeah.
But the current metrics don't capture that.
And there's so many questions, and we're running out of time now. We've got a few minutes ready to wrap up. There's questions there around, and I think we'll probably do other podcasts with others. So you mentioned kind of motor skill type stuff there, sporty people, and how do we develop that from a young age? An interesting question in my head is, when we talk about participation rate, what are we trying to achieve? Because if you're talking, you've got linguistics and you've got other types of people. Some stage people don't like sport. So we do, but there's certain people, many people don't like sport. So what is good participation in sport? I think that's a really big question.
Yeah, and I think it comes back to what you mean by sport. And I think it's fair to say, as we've mentioned with those strategies developing and the widening measurement, is sport England looking at sport in the way in which we looked at it 25 years ago? The answer is clearly not. It's wider physical activity, right? Now, if that's dance, that's fine. But then where do you draw the line, right? Could it be your active travel? Well, that's measured too. So I think clearly what we're talking about here is really wider physical activity, which sport is an important potential component of that. But sport also carries with it very significant consequences. So one of the areas of research I looked at was looking at the differential well-being that people got from engaging in stuff. And two things came to me very clearly from the research I did. And firstly, collective sports generate more well-being than individual sports. So team sports have that massive advantage. Why is that? Why, if you look back to why is that? It's because you're enjoying yourself with others. You get collective enjoyment that, I'm not saying marathon runners or ultimate athletes don't get, but they're on their own, right? So when you're part of a team, it means something. So you get that extra benefit. And the second thing that we identified, and again, this is getting a bit nuanced, which shows you how subtle some of this stuff is, that the benefits that came were greater from a kind of social point of view than the health ones. So if you compared people who are playing the sport at levels that met, say, World Health Organization guidelines, with those who are not, which suggests they're doing things less intensely, the social value to that latter group was much higher. So if you come back to what is the essence of sport, it's groups of people getting together to do something that's potentially physically moving, but they're enjoying themselves together. And maybe we've lost sight of that a little bit. So it's almost like if we focus on providing opportunities for that, the outcomes will come. So it's how do you give people the opportunity to do that, which then leads to the outcomes. And that might not mean following a very linear process through a formal organisation system. It doesn't mean to say that's not important, because it's really part of the system, but it's not the whole part. So it's having that flexibility of policy and thinking that could capture those more subtle things. But we shouldn't ever lose sight of that. Sport existed before government, and it developed in a kind of informal, associative, that is voluntary way, and it predates government intervention. So the question is why? Now you get into all kinds of history of thought, but people picked it up and enjoyed it because they enjoyed it, right? Yeah. So it's those things we've forgotten, and we can see that very much in new activities that become sports. What were pastimes when I was a kid, bicycle, motocross, or whatever, they're now Olympic sports, right? So they get pulled into the system, which is fine. But they had a function beforehand, which is about people enjoying themselves and being active.
Well, that's interesting. Again, we could talk for hours, and we often do over a coffee, but like breakdancing in the Olympics recently, they had to change the rules to be able to be an Olympic sport, whereas really it's a thing in the street and you do your thing. And
snowboarding is the other one, the classic one, which is an off-piste kind of informal youth activity that's now, and there is that debate in that community between whether they've sold out by becoming this Olympic activity, climbing, right? All climbing.
Yeah, all of which looks cool when you watch it in the Olympics, and maybe it does help grow that sport, but there's the purists, let's say, who are very much against that. Yeah.
So it's recognising that this, we might want to just call it physical activity culture, of which sport, you could call it sport, and sport clearly, and I'm thinking here about competitive sport, and team is really important. It's an important function for people to be part of. And it does provide that kind of background resonance to all the informal things that people do. I'm just thinking, people kicking a ball around for themselves, in their head, they're probably thinking about a player doing something that they've watched and so on. And even perhaps the the most casual of runners that just started, it won't be lost on them that, I'm not so bad at this, I'm doing okay. Do you know what I mean? And I've got the inspiration from somebody who they may have seen running. Somebody can do that. Somebody with a disability, God, they can run like that. Now, you may not want to ever emulate that. You might be terrified of the whole competitive thing, but somewhere in the mind will be this image of somebody doing something and challenging themselves. You're thinking in your own personal little way, that's really quite important. You're not going to measure that very easily, but it's probably there. Because otherwise, why would you be doing it, right?
Yeah. I think that there's huge warrant in that kind of self-worth at whatever level, at your level, to know that you're doing more and enjoying it, as you've just talked about. We've gone around, talked about lots of different stuff around, linked around participation and policy and, those that are able to participate more, the huge differences there are in sports and different groups of people. And we've just touched upon there a little bit about the play space, but just to kind of finish off, two questions in one, which you should never do. Where do you think we should be going with future policy, and where are you going with your future research?
So the future policy one's really interesting because one of the issues is always going to be you need money to implement policy. And given the current economic climate, I think for policy agencies to hang on to the existing budgets is quite a success. You also have to be honest. From a policy point of view, there needs to be serious evaluation about what sectors and what aspects of sport are delivering the big outcomes, because I think public money has to be prioritised at those areas that generate the best return to us all. And that may not mean going into traditional areas of work. That doesn't mean to say they're not important. But at the end of the day, if the public sector is about delivering the greatest good, then you have to think about being efficient with that. So I think some very serious reflection on which areas are delivering more effectively for society needs to be the sort of future. And that's going to sound like a politician, involve tough decisions, right? But in a resource constrained world, you have to do that. And I always take confidence by the fact that the voluntary club system, for example, is resilient because it existed before. I think that we know that things like parkrun and so on and the private sector and Power League and Purity Gym have stepped up to the mark. So I think it's really about the public sector targeting those very hard to reach things and things we talked about before, like, for example, pools that wouldn't exist otherwise. And that's so important because, like you say, it's part of a wider physical activity culture and access as well as safety, of course, very important. In terms of my own research, it's very much pushing down those lines. I'm very much interested in the transition between informal and formal activity. I'm particularly looking at women's football at the moment. I've finished a couple of studies there. But I'm moving more towards this kind of trying to explore the portfolios of behaviour that people have and the kind of transitions between their activities and the relationships between those things, because that's something we've not focused on. And I think we can sort of identify what the spillovers are between the different activities, then we can perhaps legitimately say you might be funding this, and specifically in this sport there's this, but actually that sport also underpins this other sport. So that cross-section relationship between the different activities is really important. Tricky to get at, but I think that's important because it shows you then that you're spending £1 here. It's not just going down a linear channel, but it's multiplying out across the wider sector. So if you've got money going down multiple channels, that kind of intersection is going to create much greater value than it would do if you just think about it in one way. But it's complex stuff, right? But I think this is really important for policy.
It's hugely complex, and I hope our listeners will be able to kind of take on board the kind of myriad of things that we've talked about here. It brings me back to a meeting I was involved in a few months ago, which is around PE, and we've not really talked much about PE there. But there's a group of people looking at developing a thing called PE for Life. And actually, I think this links in really, really well, because you were just talking about, and we used the example, which was very much my example, where you start off in something that might be competitive. You've got these intersectionalities of different activities, formal, informal. You might come back to some, but developing those skills at a really young age gives you the confidence to transition from rugby union to dancing, for example. And without that, you possibly wouldn't have done that, and then possibly wouldn't be as physically active as you are, or mentally as strong, and you know, the social aspect that you get with all those things, all because you could play rugby at a younger age. You're in a totally different phase of life now, but following those trends across life to see how sport has an impact across all those different stages of life, I think it's a really interesting piece. So this PE for Life thing is really just ringing in my head now, to say, actually, we all need to develop this for our life, not just for the stage we're at the moment.
Yes, I think there's a very sensible point, Martin. And of course, we didn't talk about PE, and actually in this country, they've almost become divorced from one another, sport and PE. And you're right, I was very lucky going to school in the early 1970s where I had this PE teacher. I was going to give his name then, but I probably shouldn't. But who encouraged us to play all sports. And it was clearly you're outside of the national curriculum world. So if the weather was good, let's go and have a game of cricket. Or the weather's bad, I tell you what, let's go cross country running. So all of those flexibilities and that opportunity, I think you're right, it provides the kind of foundation for you to build on going forward. And I look back to my own children who are adults now, and I had to do a lot of running around for them that I didn't have to do. And so because I was committed, I was able to do that. So somebody who may not have been exposed to that and felt the value of it to themselves may be less inclined to do. As those obstacles get greater for people to engage, they become generational and it's hard to break them down. But we're told there's a Gen Z population, they're media literate, media savvy, social media, tech, digital world, which we know there's lots of opportunities there. So we're in transformation and it may not all be bad, but it's clear that the structures may be changed because things that were developed, let's call it ostensibly in the voluntary system from a Victorian club-based model for voluntaries may not be appropriate for a digital future. So change is going to come.
That's a great place to end it. It's been really good speaking to you. And I think there's so much of this podcast that I'll re-listen to go, actually, we need to do one on this. We need to do one on this. You've just mentioned there about technology. Again, there's probably a podcast out there on that to say how that's impacted on things. There's so much that we can go from this podcast. So really appreciate your time and thanks for coming on.
My pleasure. Thank you, Martin.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Experts in Sport podcast. If you'd like to get in touch, then please contact me, Martin Foster, at m.foster@loughborough.ac.uk. Thanks for listening. See you next time.